Welcome, Traceable Designers. Today we're making the super easy no-sew scalloped swag style valance. You can use this as a straight valance on a straight curtain rod or use a 1-inch metal curtain rod for a wraparound style. It can be made with or without fringe. We'll be using the pleated and gathered swag design form. This design form is included in the pleated and gathered swag valance kit, in the short curtain valance kit, and of course in the Deluxe no-sew master decorator kit. With this valance for the smaller wraparound style, you should go up to a maximum of 38 inches. You can go to 46 inches for the straight valance panel, or you can link valance panels together for wider windows. For the wraparound style, you want to measure your fabric section, keeping in mind that you're going to be wrapping around the returns, and then you'll need to add about 5 inches to your fabric for proper sizing. This way when you trace, you know that it's going to fit around the rod returns. For the straight style, you want to make sure you measure inside of your hung and sized rod so that you are staying within the brackets. This will go up to about 46 inches wide for best results on this valance. Okay, let's begin by sizing our fabric. We want to make sure that we have a very straight edge across the top because we're going to make a rod pocket. So use the design form to straighten that out if needed. We are then going to mark off our rod hanging pocket section. This is the 1.25 marker. So you'll just follow across your folded fabric section on the back side of your fabric and then just trace across the top to connect those marks. That will give you the opportunity to align your design form properly when you position it on the folded edge. So you're going to use the lower mark, the first break on the bottom, and then align across the top to make sure that it's even. We're going to begin tracing underneath, and we're going to trace up the design form ending at the second break marker. So make sure you can see that really well and stop at the second break. Next, because we want to make a more pronounced curve, you're going to measure up from your marker, where your break marker was, 1 inch and place another mark, and then reposition your design form once again on your first marker and straight across the top. Then raise your design form up to the 1 inch lifted marker and retrace underneath the design form. To finish tracing your swag, you just flip your design form over and then position the break mark at the top of your traced line. Once you get that nice and straight, you'll have to eyeball it against the top of your fabric because there won't be a line to follow. So straighten that out and then get your tape measure. And you're just going to measure down from the lower right break now, and you're going to measure 1 inch and place a mark. Then just angle your design form down to the 1 inch mark and then finish tracing underneath the design form, ending over at the outer edge of the fabric section. To cut out your valance, just position the open side near you and then just hang on to it and then just trace up for a nice V ending at the folded side. I'm removing the little excess from the edge and then open up your fabric with the right side facing up. So now we need to mark our rod pocket section. That area will not receive lining, so you'll look at the 1.25 upper arrow and you'll mark the top edge or the top outer edge of your fabric so you'll know where to position your seam tape for attaching your lining. It's very important that the front side of your fabric is facing up. We'll be attaching the seam tape to the front side. Pull out your heat and bond fusible seam tape, open that up, and then make sure you don't have the steam on your iron and you want a medium-high heat. So we're going to be positioning the seam tape along the edge without overlapping onto the ironing board, and we're simply going to run the iron along the seam tape until we've completely framed the valance. You can position your iron and then just tear that off, and then overlap the pieces as you continue along, following the edge of your valance up to each curve, tearing off the tape, and then continue around until you're finished. When you get to the second side, it's very important that you make sure that you stop your tape at the top section where you marked for your rod pocket. So either cut a piece to size before you begin or just fuse along the edge, and then make sure you stop without running your seam tape up over the top, or you won't be able to attach your lining properly. You need to have a rod pocket on the top. Allow your seam tape to cool 100% before you begin to remove it, and just peel the pieces off, and then take all of the seam tape around all the edges, checking to make sure all the pieces are off, and then we have the exposed glue for attaching our lining. Make sure you have a straight edge on your lining. We're cutting one large piece that covers completely past the edges of the valance, aligned at the top markers where you put the heat and bond. You want to start in the center and sweep out using a sweeping motion. This will prevent buckling. So keep going back to the center, sweeping out to the side, and make sure that your outer edge is going to match up to the top of the seam tape. Once you get everything positioned, then you can go back over the lower edges, which is where the glue is, and make sure that's nice and secured. And the reason that we used a whole piece is because you made a custom size, so you don't want to try to cut out a second lining piece because it might be too small. So just follow along the back side and remove the excess lining, so then we'll be ready to reverse the panel. Make sure that you're cutting just at the edge of the panel and not onto the glue section, and then when you remove your tips from both edges, make sure you don't go beyond the glue or you won't be able to reverse your panel. Then we want to make some V cuts because this will make it easy to turn. So you'll go inside of the upper curve and the lower curve and make sure that you've got that snipped without snipping beyond the seam tape, because then you will have a hole in your valance. So make sure they're tiny little snips. Make sure you get the inside curves and the lower edge. Now to turn your valance, this is a little bit of a process. You do this slowly and easily because you don't want to push through the seams. So if everything's nice and cool, you won't have a problem. But if you try to turn this while it's still warm, you will push through your seams and you'll have to refuse them. So just push out in the corners and then iron, and you can do front and back and just keep moving along, running your fingers along the seam until you have everything fully shaped, and then just keep ironing down and moving along. So if you push too hard, you may push right through the seam, and if that happens, you can try to iron it again, or you can always cut a piece of seam tape, put that inside, let that cool completely, then pull that off. Then you can just fuse it down again and wait for that to cool before you continue along. You'll see that the corners grab a little bit, but if you stretch the fabric a bit and keep ironing, your curves come right to life. So just keep going over it until it's completely finished, and then run the iron across the front one more time. Then we're going to flip the valance over, and then we're going to make our rod pocket. So you can see here we have a nice curve. Now in this case it has a little bit of a point. So if you like your center to be a little bit more curved, all you need to do is snip that little tip off before you put your lining on. You can see this is a nice rounded curve, but be very careful because if you snip any more than just the point, it'll have an indent. So if you also wanted to make your valance larger in sizing, you can always start a little bit closer to the edge. If you can add a couple of inches there, so for every inch on the folded fabric it adds 2, and then to add the width, then of course you would be tracing across the lower edge on the right side. So now we need to secure our lining on the back so it doesn't sag, and we're going to fix our seams. We want those fused down because when you do the rod pocket, your rod pocket needs to slip through without catching. So you'll cut a couple of pieces of fusible backing, and you'll put that right on the outer edges. You'll do each seam left and right before you begin with your inner lining. So you just fuse that down, wait for that to cool, and then you'll peel off your tape and then make sure you fold your seam over to cover all that glue when you are doing your seams. Now pull everything up nice and straight. You want to make sure that you keep ironing until that's nice and straight. You want your lining actually hidden behind the front fabric. Then you're going to cut a piece of seam tape that's going to fit underneath your lining. Make sure that it is behind the lining. So you'll just position that in little sections, and then run your iron across the lining and across the tape, fusing that down. And then once that has completely cooled, you'll peel that off, and then you can secure your lining to the back of your valance. So run the iron over it as much as you need to get it nice and flat, and then once your tape is cooled, peel it off. Again, smooth your fabric starting in the center and pulling up. Always center up and center out. That way you will have absolutely no buckling on your valance, and it will hang nice and straight. So to do your rod pocket, you're going to fold it over and just heat that so that it folds down. We're going to use the heat and bond that's included in your kit to make the strips that you're going to make for your rod pocket. So you're going to cut about a 1-inch strip there, and then you're going to fuse that right across the folded fabric section, making sure that you don't overlap onto the lining or past the edge, and use as many strips as you need until you've covered the entire top edge of the rod pocket. Then once that's completely cooled, you'll peel off your paper to expose the glue. Fold your pocket over nice and tight so that you've covered over the lining. Then just fuse that down. So you might have to go over that a few times. It's going to be a little bit thicker, especially if you used a little thicker fabric. And you want to make sure the heat goes all the way through to hold that pocket. Now you really shouldn't be using anything heavier than a drapery fabric for this. Most of the time it's a cotton. So this finished valance is about 13 inches long. If you were planning to make a little deeper valance, a little longer, you would have had to size your fabric in advance, of course. So to do that, you just use the design form. The lower edge gets traced the same, but you would just add some extra height to the top of the valance fabric section before you begin. And then, of course, you would still use the same rod pocket marker. You would just have more depth to your valance fabric. So I'm planning to add a little bit of fringe to my valance. You don't need to use anything at all. It has a nice clean edge. I'm using something very lightweight, and it's really easy to apply. It's very flexible. You can use a variety of different types of trim, and I'm going to attach my trim using glue. This tube glue is easy to use, or you can just stitch it on by hand. So you're just going to follow along the edges. You'll measure out your trim so that you make sure you have plenty. And also, when it comes to using ribbon, it's very difficult because the ribbon won't curve around the edges very well. You'll find that it kind of does a break and it won't be the best result. So you can use a braided gimp trim, you can use any kind of fringe, as long as you get it nice and secure. If you're using a heavier fringe, you may want to stitch it on. The best look is when you hide the fringe in or trim inside of the outer edges. So just warm it up, and then that loosens the glue so you can get a little pocket and push your trim in on the edge or your fringe, and then you can just glue that to hold that in place as a starter. So just use a nice thin line of glue. You don't want to over glue or it'll smear onto your valance and it will show. So just make your little strip. I like this unique stitch because when I stop pressing, it stops coming out of the tube, which is a lot cleaner. Then just follow along, making sure that you don't bunch up your fringe and get the lower sections glued to the fabric. And then when you're finished with that, then you'll just move over to the other edge. Of course, snip off your trim and securely finish it by pushing it inside of the seam. To hang your valance, you can use a 1-inch metal curtain rod for the wraparound style valance, or you can use the straight decorative curtain rod, but make sure your panels are sized to fit inside of the brackets. Then just hang your beautiful no-sew scallop style valance. Thank you for joining me, Traceable Designers, and remember, you can always make your mark with Traceable Designer.